Hello. If you've seen my earlier video on the three great lies of awakening, then this is its companion. This is a map of what might be emerging next in the world. And I feel like we need to discuss these things. And awakening, this whole notion of awakening as we've inherited it, is powerful, but it's often, I think, quite incomplete, because the spirituality of the rest of this century, it needs to be not less awakened but more whole. It needs to be more whole. And so there's some truths I'd like to offer, three more, and these are truths that as I see them. And the first truth is awakening is not just about waking up. It's also about cleaning up, and it's about growing up. And if you heard these terms before, it's because you may have heard them from Ken Wilber, who's done an amazing amount of work digging into this concept. And so it's nice to mention his name here and give him the honoring that he deserves. For a long time, many people assumed that if someone had a profound awakening, or a non-dual realization, or a glimpse of the absolute, then they were somehow complete. But we sort of now know that that's not really true. A person can have a genuine awakening and they can still be, emotionally pretty immature. They can still be traumatized. They can still be deeply narcissistic. They can be relationally clumsy. They can be ethically underdeveloped. They can be unintegrated around sexuality and desire. They can be very, very dogmatic or opinionated. And they could also, of course, be spiritually inflated, in subtle ways or in obvious ways. So the old model often confused states of realization with whole person transformation. And so many teachers and gurus and seekers have had something real, something very real, like the silence that they've discovered, the insight, the direct contact with the source, and yet, despite that experience inside them of the absolute, they still struggle with shadow, with desire, with trauma or power dynamics. I mean, I have an experience from my own life of this. I had a big awakened experience back in my late 20s. And, after the 3 days of that experience, I came back into my being, and I was just the same old person with the same old issues and the same old problems, and I still am. So I kind of know this from inside myself. And, another example, a great example here actually, is plant medicine. It's a contemporary example because plant medicine can really open up these states of realization. It can open up this vertical plane directly, dramatically. It can catalyze profound insights, literally within a few hours or minutes sometimes. And it can bring a glimpse of awakening. But what opens in one night, may take years to integrate into your life. So unless you've done the clearing up and the cleaning up and the growing up, then even powerful ceremonies can produce confusion, grandiosity, all kinds of delusionary things that can go through you, or addiction, of course. Not that they will, but it's a warning. It's like any pure vertical path. So the new truth, this first truth, it's simple. Awakening is not only about waking up. It's also about cleaning up, growing up, integrating, and becoming capable of love without domination. So no one owns awakening. No human gets to plant a flag in the river and claim it's theirs. And in a way, that's one of the things that's happened with awakening. It's become a sort of club. So, second truth, and they both flow from each other. The second truth is that awakening is both vertical and yet it's also horizontal. And vertical awakening is what many classical traditions have really emphasized. up, through, beyond, transcend, pierce the veil, cut through the illusion, move to the source. It's meditation focused. It's one-pointed. It's intense. It's yogic. It's disciplined. It's aiming for essence, stillness, clarity. But that's vertical awakening. Vertical awakening on its own, it can become austere, kind of narrow. It can become over clean, over pure, if you could entertain that idea. Suspicious of complexity, subtly perhaps dismissive of ordinary life. And some of the older forms of vertical awakening, they exiled really important things like play and humor, or good old-fashioned ordinary desire and relationships, or sex, or business, or creativity, or erotic intelligence, paradox, contradiction, being things being unfinished. The vertical awakening is powerful, it's deep, it's catalytic, but it can't fully encompass the richness of life, I don't think. That's the job of horizontal awakening. And that's different. Horizontal awakening is it's broad, it's slow, and it's inclusive. It's contemplation rather than meditation. So horizontal awakening or contemplation, it can include paradox and ambiguity, relationship, community, conversation, poetry, symbol, myth, the imagination. It can include grief, love, friendship, parenting, sex, desire, pleasure, business, work, activism, embodiment, aesthetics, music, art, ritual. This is all horizontal. Inner landscapes, ancestral intelligence, indigenous and earth wisdom. Horizontal awakening includes all of those things, especially creativity, I think. I think I have a special place for creativity in this. So horizontal awakening, it's the other side. It allows all of life to live in this vast, generous field of awareness, and it teaches how to be with the world, not to transcend the world. And many people have developed on one axis but not the other. And you'll notice that the vertical awakening always seems like it's in a hurry. You've got one life, you've got to do it now. Horizontal awakening is not in a hurry. It's the opposite. It's like, wow, I can take as long as I want to saunter up the mountain. This is why it's contemplation. Contemplation is horizontal. It's gentle. It's gradual. It doesn't require that hurried approach. So think about the people that have developed one axis over the other. You might meet in your life meditators with enormous vertical depth, but very little psychological maturity. You might meet therapists with huge horizontal understanding, but little direct realization, right? Poets with immense symbolic intelligence, but very little contemplative grounding. Activists with huge moral courage, but very little inner spaciousness. Even entrepreneurs with immense creativity and courage, but no deep relational awareness. So full awakening requires both vertical and horizontal. The vertical gives the depth. The horizontal gives the breadth. Vertical reveals the source. Horizontal teaches us how to live from the source, inside the source, And one of the things you might notice, as I've contemplated this, is that why I asked myself the question, I found myself asking myself the question, why have so many public teachers of awakening always been men? Or often are men, mostly. Amen. Because many inherited spiritual forms were shaped by a predominantly masculine emphasis, ascent, transcendence, discipline, authority, one-pointedness, And all of that's beautiful and powerful and real, but it's not the whole story. What's now emerging is not so much, I hope, a rejection of the masculine, but a rebalancing into a more relational view of awakening, more receptive, more cyclical, more embodied, and more inclusive. So capacities that are sometimes culturally associated with the feminine, although of course they're present in all of us. Those kind of receptive gifts are increasingly recognized as essential to horizontal development. So perhaps, I just want to put this out there, perhaps the next spirituality is going to be less top-down, less dependent on solitary authority figures, and more mutual, more ecological, more relational. Because awakening, real awakening, it wants to be shared, it wants to be alive, it's participatory. So that's the second truth. And the third truth, which I think is the most radical, is that awakening includes romance. Okay. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that, if you bear with me. So for a long time, awakening was framed as kind of detachment, the witness consciousness. All form is emptiness. Emptiness is form, silence, transcendence, disidentification with the form, and all of that, again, is absolutely real. But the old model, again, it could become too stark, too dry, a little bit samey, perhaps a little bit boring, because what it did is that, again, it threw out eros, sensuality, and sex. It threw out money and worldly life, often, not always, I'm not saying, but just it threw out creativity and aesthetics, inner landscapes, mythology, symbolism, imagination, even place, even ancestral intelligence, even indigenous wisdom, or ritual, or sacred practice, prayer. So romance with a capital R, it brings these dimensions back. And I don't mean by romance at all. I do not mean sentimentality. And please do not misquote me around that. I mean by romance profound, sensual, aesthetic, creative, and mythic intimacy with life. With life. Juice, juiciness, food, creativity, nature. So life is not only observed, it's courted. Reality is not only witnessed, it's entered into. It's made love to. Awakening is not only freedom from form, it's a love affair with form. This notion of samsara that we escape. You can actually awaken inside samsara. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something? That's full embodiment. You don't have to leave it. You actually have to be here fully. And that's creativity. And creativity is the mainstay of the word romance that I'm talking about. Not as performance or productivity, but as the participation with life, with a life force, co-creation, shaping beauty, making deeper meaning, letting the invisible become visible, letting the soul take form. If freedom is the opening, then creativity is one of the main ways that romance becomes visible in the world. And what this does is it also restores mythic imagination, and I feel like awakening without that is devoid of something, symbolic depth, imaginal intelligence, archetypal perception, meaningful inner landscapes, synchronicity, mystery, soul making. Awakening is not only the stripping away of illusion, it's also the deepening of our participation in the world. So the new awakening can include silence, but it can also include conversation. I always wondered that, like, if you ask an awakening person, what's the difference between silence and small talk? They'd probably say nothing, right? So why not practice silence within small talk? It's like it can include everything. There's beauty to silence, going into a silent place or a silent meditation or a silent retreat, because it drops you right into the field. But then if you can't live that in any other situation, that silence is inside you. It's in between the words that I'm speaking now. And so sound also carries awakening. It doesn't require silence. It's about polarity. It's about living with polarity. See, the old form of awakening glazed over polarity, kind of just, it's all one. But actually, it takes a huge courage and maturity to actually enter into polarity and to contain it, to really explore it. I mean, in our world today, we have to know polarity. We have to be able to hold paradox, not just glance over it or get past it or try and escape from it. That's not the way forwards. So we have to be able to have transcendence and tenderness. We have to have stillness and sexuality. We have to have emptiness and aesthetics. We have to meditation and contemplation, mythic imagination and creativity, freedom and romance with a capital R. So that's my take on where awakening's going, is that we get to reframe it together. We get to kind of breathe new life into it. Because awakening isn't just waking up. That's the first truth. It's also cleaning up and growing up. The second truth is that awakening is both vertical and horizontal. It's meditation and it's contemplation. It's intensity to get to the top of the mountain, and it's also a leisurely, drifting, beautiful stroll that doesn't care how long it takes. And thirdly, awakening is about romance, and it includes the romantic imagination at the highest level, the mythic, indigenous, ecological, earth-based imagination. That's romance. The old model gives us depth, sometimes at the cost of breadth. Silence, sometimes at the cost of soul. Transcendence, sometimes without the true integration. So the new awakening, it's got to be deeper and wider. Less obsessed with leaving life, less obsessed with getting high or having the big experience, more capable of loving the experience and loving each other and being ordinary, being here, being ordinary, comfortable with ordinariness, comfortable with being unfinished. There is no finishing here. So perhaps awakening is no longer about leaving life behind, but entering into it. That's what I'm interested in, with courage and curiosity and imagination and a love that is wide enough to include everyone and everything. Anyway, those are my thoughts, and do with them what you will. But I hope they were of inspiration to you. Blessings.